This is my third ASPO conference, and Steve finally decided to let me speak, so I'm going to try not to disappoint him. The asterisk up here is by ASPO-USA is just to remind me to mention that even though I do work for the government, I'm not here today representing the government. Becky and I bought our own plane tickets and flew down here yesterday from Washington to be here today and tomorrow. So the brief is my brief, and it doesn't represent the government's views. Rather than just create a brief on nuclear power from scratch, what I did was borrow some bits and pieces of three briefs that I had seen in the past year. The first one was given by Admiral Skip Bowman. He was the leader of our naval nuclear propulsion program before the current leader. He now runs something called the Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington. It's a think tank and an industry advocacy group. Last year we invited NEI to send a representative to Boston, and they turned us down. So this year I said, well, shoot, I'll just give the brief myself. So I also have a Naval Academy classmate that works in the Department of Energy Nuclear Energy Office who provided a brief that I'll be partially using. And finally, I did spend the last year working with Amory Lovins, who runs Rocky Mountain Institute. And I have some of his views here as well. I think that I have about 20 minutes. My job is to just answer these 11 questions. So if I spend about 2 minutes on each one, I'll be doing a good job. But obviously, we know that nuclear power plants are expensive to build. They're not really as expensive to operate as some other ways of producing electricity. But they're currently subsidized by taxpayers. Should they be? Or should the playing field be level? They're fairly safe, but they haven't been 100% safe. We have had problems that I'll talk about. Can they be made secure in a post-9/11 world? They're obviously good for climate in the sense that they don't release CO2, but there are other ways of producing electricity that don't release CO2 either. Is nuclear the best? Maybe, maybe not. We haven't solved the nuclear waste problem, and until we do, it's hard to see how we would go much further forward. Fuel has been mentioned already. I'll talk about it. The workforce, is it out there to support an expansion of the nuclear power industry? Kids in America are not very interested in high school or college today and majoring in science, engineering, math, technology. So we don't have a growing workforce in this area. Weapons proliferation will always be a problem. A conflict around the world. Are we going to see some sort of conflict with Iran over their current nuclear plans? And do the net benefits outweigh the net disadvantages? If I don't get around to answering all 11 of those questions in the next few minutes, I'd like to recommend this one book to you. I think it's very balanced. It came out in 2004. Senator Pete Domenici covered all these issues very, very well. And on page 2 of the book, he couches the entire discussion about nuclear power in terms of peak oil, which might be surprising to some people. He obviously understands peak oil, and he's just as concerned about it as we are. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here, but one of these four guys is opposed to nuclear power. Is it the Texas oil man? Is it the British environmentalist? Is it the Greenpeace founder? Or is it the Colorado nuclear physicist? Yeah, if Amory Lovins were here today, he would tell you that he thinks that nuclear power costs more than other ways of producing electricity, and it does rely on subsidies. It's very risky as a financial proposition because it takes so long to produce a nuclear power plant, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong in the process. It may not be the best way of producing electricity without releasing greenhouse gases, and it still produces nuclear waste that we haven't figured out how to deal with, and it will always be a nuclear weapons proliferation concern. It used to be, and it probably is true today, that it doesn't matter how many nuclear power plants you build, you're not going to offset oil use because they're used for different purposes. But, you know, in the future, I mean, there's a plug-in hybrid out here in the lobby. If we're able to get some of our transportation energy from electricity, then this won't necessarily be the case in the future. You've heard a lot of numbers thrown out here today. I think that images are helpful. We're using 85 million barrels of oil a day. If you turn them on their side, like you see up there, a barrel of oil is about 20 inches in diameter. So you'd have a pipeline that would be 20 inches in diameter, and you can do the math. With 85 million of those would be a 20-inch pipeline that goes around the world at the equator about 1.6 times. That's what we're using every day. And since we use that much every day, a barrel that goes in the beginning of the pipeline has to come out the other end 24 hours later, and to do that it has to be going about 1,600 miles an hour. It's Mach 2, faster than a rifle bullet. That's the oil that we're using every day. And how much do we have? I think it's probably a little bit difficult for you maybe to see up there, but in the two graphs on the right is an aerial image of San Francisco, and you can see the Golden Gate Bridge there. It's about 2 miles long. If we have 2 trillion barrels of oil to begin with, the upper cube that you see there that would hold 2 trillion barrels of oil, and we've used half of it. If we really had 5 trillion barrels, it's the other box, the one on the bottom. As you can see, it doesn't look a lot bigger, but it is twice the volume, a little bit more. That's all we have. This is the Department of Energy and the EIA's projections. You've seen this before this morning. It shows us going from 85 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels per day in 2030, and that may be right. The only thing that has to happen in order for that to be true, we have to grow from 85 million barrels a day to 120 million barrels per day, so we have to grow by 35 million barrels a day, and we also have to offset the depletion that will occur in the existing fields that we have today. That's another 25 million. So all we have to do is somehow find liquid fuels that would amount to 60 million barrels a day. That's 6 times what we currently get from Saudi Arabia. So, on average for the next, between now and 2030, we have to find a new Saudi Arabia every 4 years. So if we can sort of do that, this may come to pass. And by the way, we got to do that in spite of the fact that world discoveries peaked in 1963 and they've been declining for over 40 years. This is a DOE slide. I was happy to see that they at least know about this chart. This is the USS Houston. USS Houston is home ported out in Guam. I've been just about everywhere in the world that you can go on a nuclear submarine, including the North Pole, and it's the best way to run a Navy. It's a wonderful way to run a submarine. It's a wonderful way to run an aircraft carrier, and if oil gets much more expensive, it's going to be a good way to run all of our ships. It'll be cost-effective over their lifetime. But that's not the question today, obviously. The question that we're talking about is it a good way to provide power for a country? We've had so many nuclear-powered ships, and they've been running so long that we've actually, if you can read at the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, we've amassed 5,000 reactor years of safe operations, 0 reactor accidents in the history of our U.S. Navy. We have had some problems along the way. This is a picture of the USS San Francisco made about 5 years ago after it was crossing the Pacific and ran into an uncharted submerged seamount going about 30 knots below 800 feet. And tragically, one of our sailors was killed. But the point of the slide that I would like to try to make is that we know how to build some reactor plants that are very, very robust. I mean, they're actually built to survive a torpedo, explosion a few feet away. We've also, unfortunately, had 2 of our nuclear submarines sink in the past. You know, the USS Thresher, the USS Scorpion, lost in 1963, 1968. We go back there about every year. We found those ships. We go back to the bottom of the ocean where they're located, and we test for any radioactivity, radiation released above background. There's still none today. So, you know, so we put these ships through some pretty severe tests, and so far they've worked pretty well. I think this is very, very interesting. You know, King Hubbert gave his famous talk in 1956, and it was actually titled Nuclear Energy and the Fossil Fuels. And the picture in the upper picture, that's Admiral Hyman Rickover. He's the father of our nuclear navy. He developed the nuclear navy. It's interesting, Rickover and Hubbert both lived 86 years, and their lives almost exactly overlapped. Hubbert gave his speech in 1956. That's in 1957. We started up our first commercial nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. And that same year, Admiral Rickover gave a very interesting talk about energy resources in our future. I'd recommend it to you if you haven't seen it. It's posted on the Energy Bulletin. Last week, Becky and I were with Mrs. Rickover in Washington. And I'm embarrassed to say that I was 47 years old, you know, when I realized that the problem in energy is not running out of oil. It's, you know, it's peak oil. I think everybody here hopefully understands that. But when I realized that, I thought, well, you know, if worse comes to worse, we can always build more nuclear power plants, and we will be able to solve this problem. Until you do the math. You know, if you wanted to run all the 220 million vehicles in America using the reactor technology that we have today, run them on hydrogen or electricity made strictly from nuclear power, here's what you'd have to do. You've got to build 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plants. They'll cost you somewhere between $3 and $4 billion a piece today. If you can build 10 a year, it'll take you 100 years to build them. And you'll run out of fuel before you get done building them, unless you change the fuel system that we have today, which we certainly could do. No surprise here, we get most of our electrical energy in the world and also in America from coal, about 20% nuclear. The next biggest chunk is natural gas. You can see here the cost of producing electricity since 1980 has been coming down. This is operating cost, which does not include the capital cost to build the plant. And the bottom 2 lines there are the cost of a kilowatt hour produced with coal or nuclear, and the 2 that are taken off up to the upper right are natural gas and oil, which we don't really use much more except in Hawaii. One of the ways that the nuclear industry has been able to improve its efficiency is by operating the plants more of the time. So this is the percentage of days of the year that the plants are online and operating. Back in the 80s, they operated about half the time, 55%. Today, it's up to 90%. They only shut them down if something goes wrong or to refuel them, which they have to do about every 18 months, and it takes a couple weeks. So even though electric demand in the country has grown 25% in the past 10 years, nuclear has kept steady at its share of 20% of that whole. And they've done that by increasing the operating capacity of the plants, and it actually, that's added so much capacity, it's the same as if we had built 17 nuclear power plants during that time, even though we haven't built any. The plants were all originally designed to last 40 years. That was sort of an arbitrary number because we didn't have any experience. This was a new technology. It was kind of considered a conservative initial limit. What we're doing today, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is approving license extensions for all of our 103 plants to raise them from 40 years to 60 years. So the graph there in the lower left, you can see the 3 different colors. If we extend all of the plants to 60-year licenses, we'll be at that far right curve, and if the numbers are difficult to read, the the curve starts to fall off that cliff there in the 2030s. So even if we extend all of our existing plants to the maximum lifetime that we could envision, they start to go away in the 2030s, and then they'll be gone. So the license extension process is pretty routine now. There have been a number approved. There's a number in the queue to be approved, and then we'll see the rest of them be applied for. Here's the graph that we've sort of looked at before of electricity demand in the United States, where it's expected to go between now and 2030. This should look a lot like the graph that we looked at of what's going to happen to oil demand. You know, we don't know if it's going to happen, but that's the projection between today and 2030. And the fact that those curves look alike is no coincidence, you know, because they're both based on 2 to 3% growth in GDP. You got to have oil for transportation, you got to have electricity for economic growth, so the curves have the same shape. This was a shocker to me when I saw it. Down the left side of this graph are the different regions of the U.S. electric grid. And then across the top are the years between now and 2012. And this shows you, for each area, when the area will reach zero spare electrical capacity. So where you see a zero, that's where the growth in population or the growth in demand has reached the point where there is no spare. There's a lot of red zeros up there, if you can't see them all. So if you don't build some kind of new power plant, nuclear or coal or something else, by those dates, those parts of the country run out of the ability for further growth. If you want to meet that growing demand for electricity and keep the portfolio as it is today, this is what you have to do. You have to build about 50 large nuclear power plants, over 260 coal plants, and about 280 natural gas plants. Can we do that? I don't know. You'd have to build more than 2 nuclear power plants per year on average every year between now and 2030 in order for that to happen. Natural gas prices have obviously skyrocketed, and this has stimulated interest in nuclear power plants. In the last 15 years, this is the investment in various aspects of electrical generation capacity and infrastructure. You can see there are 288 gigawatts, gigawatts of natural gas-fired generating capacity in that time period. We only have 100 gigawatts of nuclear total. So just in the last 15 years, we've built more than 3 times the capacity of our total nuclear in the way of gas-fired power plants. So all of those factors obviously are creating interest in new nuclear power plants. Should we do it? If we do it, I think what you'll see is mainly these new plants will be built on existing sites. That makes it a lot easier for utilities to get the licenses approved. There are about, I think this is 12 different companies that have talked about applying for licenses in the U.S. for 27 new plants. The good news here is those plants, there are only 4 different designs. That's a big improvement from the past where each plant was custom built. So it would be like Southwest Airlines where all the planes are alike, and so the pilots can fly different planes and the parts are interchangeable. It would be a big improvement over the past. The problem, though, I think in financing these new plants is that each plant costing $3 to $4 billion. That's large compared to the market value of most of these utility companies. So it's a big risk for them. In fact, if you add up the market value of all those companies, it's less than half the market value of Exxon. So the government is trying to make this a safer bet for the utilities. In the Energy Policy Act of 2005, had 3 measures: federal loan guarantees up to 80% of the construction costs, some production tax credits while the plants are operating, and then basically some insurance to protect the utilities if something goes wrong in terms of delays or litigation during the construction process. If those subsidies are in effect, Then what you see here is that nuclear becomes slightly less expensive than coal, so it becomes an economically viable. In order to streamline this process, the industry has made several changes. The regulatory process has been streamlined. You no longer have to get a separate construction and operating license that's combined. Plants will be standard designs. Construction practices are modular, off-site, prefab to where they can be to save time. Design changes aren't allowed. Once the plant starts construction, it's harder to intervene and stop production once it starts. And we're dealing with a more mature technology, so there's reason to expect that it would go better in the future. Around the world, there are 27 power plants in construction right now, of course none in the US. We have more reactors than any other country, but there are 17 countries that get a greater share of their electrical energy from nuclear than we do. Obviously, nuclear produces most of the emission-free energy, so it's responsible for most of the avoided carbon. But there are other ways to produce power without emitting carbon. Renewables, obviously. If you need a new 1,000 megawatts and you compare nuclear to renewables, obviously nuclear has a high load factor. It operates steadily all the time, whereas renewables are intermittent and we don't have good storage. On the other hand, nuclear plants have a finite lifetime. Solar, hydro, wind keeps operating. You don't have to have fuel for renewables. You don't have to decommission renewables when they reach, maybe they don't ever reach the end of their life. They don't generate waste. Renewables don't lead to international disagreement. A nuclear power plant today probably would take about 7 to 10 years to build. How long would it take to construct 1,000 megawatts of wind or solar? I don't think we really know, because we really haven't done it. The cost, obviously, you can't hardly buy a windmill today. There's a huge backlog. If we want to go build a 1,000 megawatt nuclear or a wind power farm, you probably have to wait a long time to get all those windmills. Everybody thinks that nuclear is great for climate because it doesn't emit CO2, but you have to think further. Suppose you need a new power plant and you have $1 billion to spend. You might be able to buy a 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant, or you could buy 1,500 megawatts, let's say, of renewables, or maybe you could buy a 5,000 megawatt gas plant. So there's a choice here to be made. If you buy the nuclear plant, then you didn't get somewhere between 500 and 4,000 more megawatts of generating capacity because you bought the most expensive option. So therefore, you avoided an opportunity to offset even more CO2 emission, because even if you had bought gas, you would have ended up emitting less CO2 because you could have that gas could have offset a lot of coal. If you compare nuclear to coal, obviously the nuclear plants are more expensive. They do generate some waste. Here's a comparison of a 1,000 megawatt plant. The 25 tons of waste that it would generate sounds like a lot, but that's only 3 cubic meters of waste. The big difference, of course, is it's controllable. It's not released directly to the environment like it would be for a coal power plant. People think that we have centuries of coal. That's not necessarily true. We have 250 years of coal in America at the current rate of use, but the rate of use is not constant. It's growing. If we grow at 2% per year, that 250 years shrinks to about 100 years. If you convert some of the coal to liquid fuel, that makes it even worse. Coal power plants actually emit uranium because coal is contained in uranium. In fact, if you live within 50 miles of a coal power plant, you'll get more radiation exposure above background than you would living 50 miles from a nuclear plant. Safety will always be a major concern. This is the exposure of the workers at the power plants, the pressurized water plants. The trend is good. At the boiling water plants, the exposure is well within limits, coming down. This is the unplanned shutdowns of power plants in America. You can see a blip there in 2003. That's the August 2003 blackout in the Northeast. When the grid goes down, a nuclear power plant shuts down automatically, and it can't start back up for about 2 weeks. 3 Mile Island was our worst problem in America in the nuclear industry. It was considered an accident in the sense that we had some fuel damage, but in a way it's a success story. You know, the plant worked as designed. No radioactivity was released to the environment. No one was killed or injured. And there were 2 units there. The second one still operates today. If you compare that to worldwide to the coal industry, for example, 5,000 people a year die in coal mines. And if you look at historic U.S. fatalities, no one has ever died as related to a nuclear incident in America. But you can see the other statistics there. Nothing compares to the chemical disaster in India in 1984, where 4,000 people died. Security, we're in the post 9/11 world, so a lot of extra attention is obviously being focused on security of our 103 nuclear power plants. We've got a lot of extra security forces that we didn't have prior to 9/11. What to do with the waste is still a concern. Yucca Mountain is built, but it's not certified to accept spent fuel. And if it were, there's enough spent fuel standing by at our plants today to fill it up to its legal limit. It could change the legal limit, but so far we haven't. And in fact, the government promised that the Yucca Mountain would open in 1987. They promised the utilities that, and it didn't happen. So as a result, we owe fines. We owe $7 billion in fines to the utilities while they continue to store the waste on site. There are other ways we could deal with the waste in terms of reprocessing. Steve's telling me I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip ahead. The spent fuel from our power plants today is in 39 states at 131 different locations. Every one of them has to be individually secured. Would it make more sense to put them all in one place? This is Reliant Field in Houston. You could take all this spent fuel from the past 50 years of American commercial nuclear power, put it on Reliant Field, it'd be 15 feet deep on a football field. And there's enough unused uranium-235 in that spent fuel to make enough energy to equal the energy you could get from all the oil in Anwar, about 6 billion barrels of oil equivalent. And you could put 3 feet of concrete on there, and you could live on it. I'm not trying to downplay the hazards of spent fuel, but I think it's worthwhile to think about this. People live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki today. They really never left. There's an island in the Pacific called Inuitak where we dropped 46 atomic and hydrogen bombs. People have been living there since 1980, and they eat the fish from the lagoon. They are not sick, and their kids don't have 3 eyes. There was also a place in Africa called Oklo that had a natural reactor. There was enough uranium, enough water. It had a critical reactor that operated for about 1 million years. It ran out of fuel about 1 billion years ago. And those fission products and the plutonium that were generated, they're still there. They've moved about 3 feet in the last 1.5 billion years. Fuel is becoming more expensive. We get half of our fuel for our reactor plants today from former Soviet Union weapons. The good news is we've used enough of that to account for about 20,000 nuclear weapons that have been burned up or will be burned up. The bad news is we run out of those in 2013. And there was an MIT study in 2003 that shows it's the world going from about 360 to about 1,000 reactors. And the problem is that to provide the fuel for those reactors for another 30 years to 2080, you got to have 3 times the known worldwide reserves. So I think I'm out of time, but thank you very much.